Welcome to The Golden Shadow, the podcast about psychology, philosophy, myth, mysticism, and mystery. My name is Arran Rogerson.
And I'm Alyssa Polizzi.
Today, we're talking about masculinity and femininity. These two terms describe a duality, different ways of being in the world. In people, we think of it as a pattern of interest, a way of approaching social situations and romance, a way of interpreting problems and how best to solve them. But though men tend to be more masculine and women tend to be more feminine, these polarities are not necessarily tethered to biological sex. In fact, they may predate sex itself, as expressions of the yin and yang, chaos-order duality of the cosmos. So when we hear these terms, masculinity and femininity, what do we think of?
I think what initially comes to mind is, how do men and women gather, or those who are kind of cultivating a space of masculinity and femininity? What does that look like? So women often come together to support and share. They cultivate this really sort of tender and nurturing space. It's very emotionally informed, sensitive. There's usually a focus on a really deep relational aspect, understanding each other's experience, really tapping into that feeling function, you might say.
Yeah.
And then we kind of have that flip side of the masculinity. What is it like when men come together? They often gather and want to problem solve, to engage in active sports, to kind of lift each other up through mutual competition. It's kind of like a type of bonding through challenge, physicality.
Sure.
Even more of that more logical, rational thinking function being tapped into.
Mm-hmm. And you can see this in masculine and feminine relationships, romantic relationships, often where men are trying to problem solve a lot, and women might be looking for more of a feeling, bonding sort of way to communicate. And a lot of arguments, a lot of conflicts, I think, stem from these two different ways of kind of looking at the world or approaching the world.
Yeah.
And so there's all these stereotypes about men and women that we are familiar with. They're founded in truth, of course, but they do get exaggerated sometimes. But we're trying to get into something deeper than just what's a man and what's a woman. We're trying to tap into something that you might say is more archetypal, something that is deeper than that, something that, as I said, might transcend humans, might transcend animals. It might be a way that the universe is structured, the way the universe flows.
A fabric of reality.
Right.
That's sort of expressed through these deeper principles that kind of seem to govern the way that the universe is structured. But I feel like whenever we start to tap into that framework, we're also seeing it flow down to the very human level. And then we see it expressed through behavior and personality type and orientations towards the world. And certainly with masculinity and femininity, there's like a typical way of approaching it, right? Where we're just like, men are kind of forced into this one box, and this is what it means to be a man, and to express masculine ideals. And the same goes for women, but it's much more gray than that.
Right. And men can be feminine, women can be masculine.
Yeah,
that's something that we're familiar with, the idea of this. And so what do these two things mean? What is this duality? And I think one way that it has been expressed in the past, and that is hopefully familiar somewhat to people who might be listening, is the notion of yin and yang, right? And this kind of reflects a notion of chaos and order. Yin meaning dark side of the mountain, yang meaning light side of the mountain, this notion of dark and light. And it's trying to tap into this idea that there is a flow of the universe in which things can disintegrate, or they can become chaotic and disordered, and that leads to potential for falling apart, but also potential for creation and birth and restructuring, reintegrating. And then there's another force in the universe that seems to bring things together towards order, towards structure and rules. And there's sort of an integrative aspect of the universe, and then there's things that entities in general often seem to flow between these two, to find a balance between the two, because the two are almost partners. They work off one another. Neither one is bad or good. It's and that's the idea of the yin yang. That's the symbol. The taijutsu, is that what it said? Yeah. Taijutsu or something like that. The black and white fish swimming together. But the whole idea is that they're swimming, they're dancing always.
Right. You can't have one without the other. Even though we might, in a simplistic way, say, well, chaos is bad. Like, we don't want that. But when we think about that dark principle, like the shadow of the mountain, that which is birthed from some principle that is kind of unknowable and ununderstandable. It's just this intricate web of potentiality that doesn't have structure to it, doesn't have rules. That's kind of like the chaotic element. The kind of birth of the universe comes from that principle, and then some type of ordering thing comes and kind of flows around it and kind of makes sense of it and stabilizes it. And that's kind of what we're tapping into on that deeply meta level. But at the same time, we see expressed even in regular relationships, that we find these natural flows that balance each other out and seek to kind of find harmony between these more, you might say, outward expressive principles and a more inward reflective principle.
Right. So some more examples of this idea is the left and right brain. There's this question, why is the brain divided into two halves? Why? Why are there two hemispheres,
Yeah.
Why is there left and right? And there is this idea that it's not as black and white as this, but there's this notion that the left is in some sense order, it's structure, it's sort of a more intellectual side. It's
Right,
trying to kind of
right.
rationally structure reality,
Yeah.
process the known or work within the known, the map that you have, whereas the right brain is more chaotic, more open
Sure.
to creation,
Right.
more generative. It's birthing information or structure in some sense, and there's this dance between the two
Yeah.
that almost is the dance of growth or the dance of moving through reality, where the way that we actually grow as people, and this is reflected in the notion of individuation too,
Yeah.
is there's an oscillation between order and chaos, integration, structuring, and then
Right.
disintegration,
Yes.
and then reintegration,
Right.
and this back and forth kind of flow where you go someplace, you ascend a little bit, and then you have to kind of descend a little bit more, and then you wash off what doesn't belong, and then you kind of bring it back together, and you ascend more, and then you descend some, and this oscillation back and forth, I think you see entities do this,
Yeah.
this oscillation, this partnership between these two poles, and you can see this also in left and right politics. That's one more example. I mean, I think you can see this in many more places, but there's sort of the left side of politics that's moving towards change, towards deconstruction in order to build something better. That's the idea. And the right side is often trying to maintain order and structure, maintain the status quo, prevent deconstruction.
Right.
And these two sides, people have trouble thinking of these two sides as being a balance.
Right.
And it's easy to kind of think of one side's bad, one side's good, which is unfortunate. But they do kind of work together. They do maintain a structure. They prevent collapse.
Right.
Some change, but not too much change too quick.
Right. These things seem deeply in opposition of each other, but you would say the same if you were looking at it so dualistically, like hot and cold, those oppose each other, right? But it's actually the spectrum of possibility, or that we don't want to be fully immersed in heat and flames all of the time, and we don't want to, lock ourselves in an icy tundra. We need both to kind of find the middle ground, and actually to be able to walk the path towards maybe growth and expansion and sustainable development. It's actually straddling both of those worlds. And even just to bring it back to that point on individuation, it is that dance of chaos, of opening yourself up to, say, the wild nature of the unconscious, that which is kind of birthing all of this intense energy and potential within, and that has to be met by that ordering principle of the ego, of consciousness, to integrate, to make sense of it, to establish some rules. But if you stick to one side, say, of ego consciousness, you never really expand kind of beyond a certain level.
Right.
You need that chaotic, natural principle of the unconscious to provide inspiration, to be kind of like the muse of life potential. And of course, if you were on that other side, deeply embedded in the unconscious, you'd kind of lose your grounding as an individual. So we really sort of see this expressed in all these different ways.
Definitely. So that's where this idea of partnership comes in, right? The chaos and the order are partners. The yin and yang are partners.
Yeah.
They're joined, they're intertwined. You might even say they're the same entity.
Yeah.
They're just sort of an oscillation
Yeah.
that the entity experiences. And, this may be a big stretch, but, men and women could be an expression of this. The duality that men and women are is an expression of this pattern of this universe, of finding balance, of being able to grow and propel oneself through the world and do that in a way that you maintain structure, you maintain homeostasis, you can survive, but you also are open to change. That might be what men and women reflect, is this strange pattern of the universe.
You certainly think about that, and there might be a reaction for those listening of just like, well, that's not right, or that's not fair, or that seems kind of overly simplified or too traditional. But when we start to think about these masculine and feminine dynamics as just human principles that we all embody across this sort of spectrum of kind of expression of our psychology and our spirit, masculinity and femininity can be essence of ourselves that really kind of ignites within us sometimes a masculine force and sometimes a feminine force, and that's met on the other side in that partnership with someone else's masculine and feminine force.
Right.
So a man who happens to be a little bit more feminine in nature finds his partnership in someone who can meet that balance with masculinity. And it sort of transcends those generalized sort of stereotypical ideas of what that partnership actually looks like.
Right. So, even within the individual, there's a masculine and feminine balance.
Yes.
Ideally. Right.
Ideally,
so
yeah.
these forces, again, if we can kind of detach from the notion of what men are and what women are, and that sort of tethering to the biological notion, and sort of think of this more as this abstract force of, again, sort of integration, disintegration, kind of the oscillation within you, there's a partnership between these forces of opening oneself up to disorder and closing oneself off and maintaining order, that you're breathing that as you go through life. We see that in partnerships between men and women, obviously. That's the default notion of this, is that men and women make good partners. There shouldn't be any question about that.
Yeah.
They've been partners for all of time since sex first emerged. Well, that goes back pretty far, but still. As long as humans have been around, the partnership between men and women is a good partnership. They work together. Right. They cover all the bases.
Sure.
But you also see this in same-sex partnerships.
Yeah, definitely.
Often. There is just the notion that often in same-sex partnerships, there is a masculine figure and a feminine figure. But it's more gray than that.
Yeah.
But either way, the covering the bases, the entity is the relationship.
Right.
And the entity needs to have a healthy oscillation between chaos and order.
Yeah.
And so often the partnership between two people, or maybe more, who knows, there's a balance that you're finding, covering all the bases, right?
Yes. We naturally find it in others. And as we mentioned a moment ago, it's a dance that's happening internally as well. And I think just to tap into the ideas from the Jungian perspective of the archetypes of the anima and the animus, which kind of explores the sort of contrasexual image or experience that's in each individual. So for a man, there's like an internal feminine figure, and for a woman, there's an internal masculine. And I think when Jung was really starting to approach this idea, especially in very classic, traditional 19th century Europe, 20th century Europe, it's maybe quite revolutionary to think about what the feminine presence is in a man of that age, and to start to really tap into developing that within oneself, to not rely upon a partner to be more of the emotional go-between. Instead, he could tap into those parts of himself and find a nurturance and the feeling function and that sense of creation and connection. And so within each person, we really kind of need to develop within ourselves that duality, so that we have that expression easily accessible and it's not kind of banished to the shadow.
Right. So if we think about this from an evolutionary perspective, I think this is really useful. But if we go back to the environment in which humans evolved, the hunter-gatherer environment, prior to about 12,000 years ago, men and women had roles in tribes, and this is, a source of some contention about talking about this, but I think it's pretty irrefutable that there was a division of labor between men and women in tribes, and there was something that men evolved to do, which I would say is the kind of order function, and there was something that women evolved to do, which is sort of the creation function, which could also be rephrased as chaos or disorder or creation. They go together, right? But men in tribal situations would probably be the ones who went out to do things. The active principle. They go outward. They explore. They terraform the world. They bend nature to their will. They're kind of this source of culture, which is trying to warp nature to work for you in some sense. So they're going hunting. They're going gathering. They're building things. They're exploring. They're pathfinding. They go out and they bring stuff back to the tribe where the women probably are.
Yeah.
And the women are charged with the most important task of all, which is giving birth.
Yeah, life. Yeah.
Children.
Yeah.
They're incredibly valued, incredibly important for this way. They need to be protected.
Yeah.
So this sort of idea of the receptive or the passive or the one who stays behind and kind of holds down the fort, protects the torch, protects the fire of human life, keeps it burning while the men go out and come back and forth. You're kind of getting this image of, again, this active principle going out and doing things and kind of building up structure, and this kind of creative principle and covering all the bases. Doing this well, this division of labor means you have a successful tribe that survives.
Yeah, it certainly kind of brings to mind as well the idea behind that wily, adventurous, risk-taking nature of men or of the masculine principle. And when one is sort of tasked, especially from like this evolutionary perspective of going out and establishing or kind of finding the resources and bringing them back, they're ultimately putting themselves in quite grave danger.
Right,
and
there's a lot of risk associated with
dispensable.
that. Yeah.
And with that kind of comes this, not fearlessness, but you're willing and ready to face whatever lies in the great beyond.
Right.
And that kind of instills in an individual this willingness to kind of take up the role of the hero and leave the known space, to leave the village.
Right. And this is reflected, of course, in the hero's journey story. The hero's journey is the masculine story.
Right.
It doesn't mean that a woman can't take the hero's journey. Yeah. It's just that it's a masculine story.
Yes.
And that reflects this idea of the masculine individual, who's the hero, who goes out into the wild, as men would have done in our ancestral environment, and they combat the wild danger and chaos of the forest or the wilderness. Yeah. They bend it to their will, and in doing so, they create a new order that can be habitable, that the tribe can inhabit. And that's sort of the masculine story, and it's dangerous, and it requires a lot of self-sacrifice. And the hero's journey is usually a story of self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
The hero doesn't always die, but if the hero does die or become wounded, that's kind of part of the story, and it's compelling, and we find that to be something very admirable. Like, he gave his life for the greater good.
Right.
That's kind of a masculine story. The idea that women would do that they would go out and sacrifice themselves, it doesn't make as much sense, because women are valuable and important because they have children. They give birth.
Right.
Yeah, I know this can be kind of like a weird concept. I know that, again, there's a lot of controversy around this idea, but like, men are more dispensable than women. The idea that 10 men could go out and get killed, it's like, well, the tribe will be okay. But the idea that 10 women get killed, it's like your tribe might be done.
Right.
And you only need one man and 30 women to create a bunch of babies. You can't have 30 men and one woman and restart the tribe. So again, this notion, we see it in movies, this notion of like women and children first, like to get off the Titanic that's sinking, like women and children in the lifeboats, men stay on board because you can be sacrificed. Right. And that again ties into this kind of pattern that we see with masculinity. Right. Self-sacrificial, going to war. There's this instinct, it's a very old instinct, of the people who go to war are men. Yeah. People who go to World War I are men. People who die are men. Women stay home. They hold down the fort. And we can see this even now in like the way that men kind of approach their existence.
Right. And even if we look to the animal kingdom, we often see this in groups of animals as well, that you might have, as an example, a pack of wolves, and they'll raise the young. And by a certain age, the young males, there's just something instinctive that draws them away from the pack. And it's made up mostly of the women. And this, like the sisters and the lineage of the mothers that are still there, and the alpha female. And of course, at a certain point, an alpha male might come into it and help breed, but it's based very much around the feminine kind of holding the tribe together, and the men sort of coming in and doing what they need to do to populate. And then at a certain point, the young males, they venture off, and it's time for them to find their own journey, to create their own pack.
Right. And there's other species of like cats, for instance, I think are a good example, or big cats in the wild. But what the males do is they just go out and live by themselves, and they find the females and mate, but they just go out in the wilderness and kind of do their own thing. Whereas like the women are charged with raising the young.
Right.
That's what they do.
The pride is actually mostly like a feminine dynamic that's happening, made of female lions.
Right. So there's this notion of the dangerous mama bear. It's like that's what is thought of as being dangerous. It's like if you encounter cubs, mama bear is dangerous and she will kill you if she feels like the cubs are threatened.
Yeah.
It's like, well, where's Papa Bear? It's like Papa Bear's out by himself.
Yeah, and sometimes she has to protect the children from a strange male bear that comes, because if he kills the cubs.
Right, infanticide is very common in the animal kingdom, and that's a whole other story. And the fact that human men can raise someone else's child nowadays is like a biological miracle, but we won't get into that. Anyways, I think it's interesting kind of approach like some myths with this pattern. One of the myths that we had talked about that illustrates kind of this idea, this dynamic well, is the Odyssey, Odysseus, and his wife Penelope.
Right. Yeah, I think Penelope isn't often talked about when the Odyssey comes up. Of course, like, we are entranced with the story of Odysseus, and we're following all of his trials and tribulations on his hero journey. But the feminine journey in the Odyssey is just as important. And here we see her tasked with this really almost impossible challenge of holding the space of the home and of the sort of like royal seat, kind of, I don't know, I think within her she knows that Odysseus will come back. So there's this kind of deep unconscious knowing that the partnership needs to be held. And she spends the entire story really sort of fighting off all of these suitors, of protecting her son, of making sure that Ithaca stays safe. And she's not out there warring. She's not out there fighting. She isn't facing those really obvious sort of external challenges. She's reliant very much on her own sort of internal principles. She has to maintain this very delicate kind of relational dynamic between all these men that are coming. Her challenge here is almost as difficult. It's just in a different way. Right.
And a lot of what she's doing is she's helping to maintain social cohesion. She's disarming a lot of like violent masculine energy.
Right, yes.
She's keeping everyone happy, making sure everyone has what they need, and this is incredibly difficult to juggle this kind of social chaos and find a way to smooth things over, and that's something that women are very good at.
Yeah, just naturally.
People who are feminine are very good with social dynamics, diving into those waters and finding a way to smooth things over and make sure people get along.
Yeah.
That can also turn into a shadow form of that, where you could wield social dynamics as a weapon.
Certainly.
That, women can do. But that's in contrast again to Odysseus, who's doing the more masculine journey.
Yes.
Who is out, going to war, going to conquer some sort of chaos in this situation. And it's an interesting story because he's most of what his journey is trying to get home.
Yeah.
He's basically separated from where he needs to be, which is in some sense the tribe, where his wife is, where she's holding down the fort. He's trying to get back, and that's sort of a masculine story of being out in the wilderness in the danger and having to deal with all these existential, more obvious threats, more of actual violence and monsters and stuff like that. Another interesting dynamic that's well known is Frodo. And I think it's interesting because Frodo and the Fellowship in Lord of the Rings, Frodo is a very feminine character.
Right.
Even though he's kind of going on a masculine journey sort of to take the reign to the mountain.
Yeah.
It's like Frodo is protecting something valuable.
Yeah.
And that's very feminine.
Yeah. I think even within Frodo, we start to see that kind of unique expression of the feminine and masculine journey applied to these more mythological or fictional dynamics, because outwardly, Frodo is a hobbit. He's not a fighter. He's not on the front lines of facing these kind of more violent challenges. He's got Aragorn, he's got Legolas. He's got these more obvious masculine heroes to play that role, to sacrifice themselves.
Yeah.
But he is on the hero's journey,
Right.
and then he's walking it in a deeply feminine principled way, which is in some ways, I feel like Frodo is the heart of the Fellowship and keeps the relational dynamics kind of smoothed between them because they're all rallying around Frodo. He's connecting the dwarves and the elves who hate each other. He's bringing man. All these different elements are coming together and harmonizing for this greater goal of really saving the world.
Right. If Frodo is not protected, all is lost.
Yeah.
And that, again, reflects this sort of evolutionary idea, is this thing must be protected, and the men will throw themselves into the danger to protect this thing.
Yeah.
And you see that throughout the story. Bran and Mira from Game of Thrones, maybe a little less well known, but probably a lot of people who are listening are aware of this. But Bran is the three-eyed raven. He holds some power within him that is incredibly important to the world surviving, and it needs to be protected. He must be transported someplace with these masculine figures around him protecting him, like Mira, who is female, but she plays this masculine role of doing the dangerous things, having the weapons, putting herself in danger, carrying Bran literally.
Bran's story is really interesting because this young boy, Brandon Stark, has all this promise. He wants to be a knight. He wants to walk the masculine hero's journey. And then there's this accident and he becomes paralyzed. And when that happens, something awakens within him. It's this power, this force, this potential. He basically becomes the heir to this old magic. And it's all contingent on him surviving and getting past the wall to this teacher for the lifeblood of this magic to continue. So he kind of moves away from that classic masculine story and starts to embed the feminine ideal and that journey into his life. And you start to see that kind of turned on its head, where his companions then, the woman, as you mentioned, Mira, she takes on the masculine ideal. She must protect him. All must sacrifice themselves to make sure that Bran, carrying that life force, moves through to where he needs to go.
Right. So there's this classic notion that we have, generally speaking, of what it means to be masculine in a virtuous way. And there are these notions that we've been talking about of bravery, of self-sacrifice. Men are engineers. Men build things. They're good problem solvers. The people who go out and build the world, the source of a lot of this notion of culture. If culture is kind of structure and rules, men are going out and building the world. And they're protecting the world, and that's kind of this notion of like the virtuous, like wise king. It's like that's this side of masculinity that's like the light side of someone who is self-sacrificial, brave, strong, protective, provides and maintains structure that is habitable, that maintains the walls around the city to protect the city, the one who builds the house over your head to protect you. But this can also fall into the shadow realm. And what does that look like? The shadow masculine.
Yeah, well, taking the idea of that benevolent king, the shadow kind of takes them into the more tyrannical nature of the king archetype, and so there might be abuse of power or dominance or aggression, where those boundaries and structure and power can be used to kind of lift up and bring order. It can in turn kind of become darker and become oppressive in nature. And kind of in a more grounded way, we see men often fighting to be at the top of a hierarchy that might not even be clear that they're engaged in. And so there's that aggression, the desire maybe to be deeply competitive in a way that's kind of violent in nature, or kind of rips individuals down versus kind of building them up through competition. So we start to see that kind of happening with the masculine principle.
Right. Shadow masculinity, it's also reflected in a lot of men who don't know how to integrate their masculinity properly, right?
Yeah.
So it gets banished to the shadow realm, and that's where you get these sort of strange, violent outbursts from men. You get men who are playing a lot of video games, because video games like simulate what the archetypal man does, which is like the hunter and gatherer.
Right.
A lot of video games are almost literally simulating hunting gathering, where you go out into the wild and you fight monsters and you gather treasure.
Right.
That's what men were sort of born to do, and that's why a lot of these video games are so popular, and men can get kind of sucked into that. And again, the tyrant, the notion of too much rules, too much structure.
Right.
That structure is good. Like building the walls around the city is good.
Right.
Building the house to have a shelter overhead is good.
Right.
But, what if the walls of the city become like, well, you can't leave.
Right.
You have to stay within the city. Now it's a prison.
Yeah.
Or the house becomes this place where the man has complete control and dominance over everyone in it, and forces people to do what he wants at all times. And this is sort of this notion of the bad father.
Right, yeah. It's like unyielding control.
Right. Abusive control.
Right.
Or even this notion of like, you're going to be a doctor, goddammit. Like, that's what you're going to do. It's like the father being overly imposing that structure, that order, trying to like squeeze people.
Yeah.
So what about the virtuous feminine?
The virtuous feminine, I think a lot about that classic kind of great mother archetype, which is that deeply receptive principle that nurtures and creates a space of harmony and connection. There's kind of this deeply intuitive nature that comes from the feminine principle that allows you to really sense kind of where someone else is at. And so you tap into empathy and compassion, and it allows people to feel seen and heard and cared for and understood. And that kind of radiates this deep interconnecting flow that the feminine principle really does. And especially when I think women come together in this way that they're trying to share and deeply open up, it's like this connective energy kind of happens, and they're flowing from one to the other. And there's this sense of real aliveness that comes when the feminine principle is really virtuous in that way, because it allows people to feel that they can open up, that they can be vulnerable, that they can trust and kind of ease into the space and be held.
Right, a different kind of safety almost than the masculine safety.
Yeah.
The man builds the house, but would say that the feminine has this more of a social kind of empathic, loving, unconditional love.
Yeah, she tends the fire. It's the hearth. It's like the Hestia principle, the goddess of the hearth. And it feels warm and inviting, and that you can recuperate and regenerate. And there's life, fire gives life and all of this energy.
Yeah, and that stereotype that I was saying, like, the father's saying, like, oh, you're going to be a doctor someday, goddamn.
Yeah.
And then, like, we see this stereotype of, like, the child feeling hurt by the father, pushing them so much, and the child runs to the mother, and the virtuous mother says it's okay.
Yeah, it's
like,
okay.
Your father, like, loves you, but he's kind of, loses his temper sometimes. And the mother's always there to, like, catch the child who is falling. And sometimes he is falling from the father who has pushed him too hard. And we see this again, the partnership there between the mother and the father, the good cop, bad cop kind of thing can be a typical thing.
Yeah.
And it's not always men and women. Those roles can definitely be reversed.
Yeah, definitely.
What about the shadow feminine?
Yeah, the shadow feminine, sticking with that idea of the mother. She goes from the great mother to like the smothering mother or the devouring mother. And here that unconditional desire to love and nurture becomes codependent and limited. It's different than like the masculine's way of like forcing you into position and sticking you there. It's almost like, the overfeeding of too much good energy that can come from that feminine principle that kind of stifles an energy from moving out into the scary, unknown world. So it can kind of smother in that way, or it can devour and kind of try to pull all of the energy out of a situation because there's a type of maybe like subtle manipulation that's happening. Where the feminine is really kind of losing focus of that interconnected relational principle. And it might be kind of being driven by some sort of like narcissism that forces the feminine kind of power to really overtake a situation in a way that might not be as overt.
Right. So the woman wields, again, this power of social dynamics. There's kind of the unconscious realm, the feeling realm, being kind of more in the shadow. Not the shadow in the sense of the banished energy, but in the kind of the moon energy, the unconscious energy.
Right.
But that can definitely be wielding social dynamics in a violent way. Is something that women are quite good at, and that's why there's a lot of gossiping. Often there's sort of ruining someone's reputation.
Yeah.
There's all these whispers going on behind people's backs, and like what you're doing is you're wielding social dynamics the same way that you could in a virtuous way smooth things out and make people come together and make them feel safe. You can also make people feel very unsafe by manipulating them in this way.
Right, like that idea, the archetype of like the mean girl or the clique group is so painful and difficult, especially I think for young girls to like experience that, because it's not something that is as obvious as boys who are mad at each other or want to take out aggression, and so they fight, and it's like, well, that's terrible. We don't want physical violence, but women can be very underhanded, or the feminine principle can come in this way that's very subtle due to that kind of more passive nature, and yet still kind of cutting to a very painful, deep core aspect, because in some ways the feminine with that intuitive, empathic nature kind of knows really where to stick the knife. And it's a power that can really be used to really hurt another. So how can we approach our shadow work and self-reflection with these ideas and themes of masculinity and femininity in mind?
So with shadow work, often what we're trying to do is sort of bring something to the surface, right? The whole notion of the shadow is what we're not seeing or what we're not paying attention to.
You're not conscious of.
What we're hiding from ourselves, what we're banishing away, denying.
Yeah.
And so the question is, how can you kind of become more aware of these concepts in yourself, these dynamics that are at play in your relationships, in the conflicts that you get into, in the way that you are at work, let's say. So just thinking about what it means to be masculine for me, for instance, I'm a pretty masculine person. Not totally masculine. I'm definitely not the most manly person that people would think of, like in our social scene, whatever. But I am someone who's very engineering. I am very instinctual about problem solving. Yeah. There's a lot of structure that I like. I like things.
Logical and rational.
Yeah, definitely very structured. I have a very systematic approach to things. And that's a very masculine way to be. Yeah. I'm a builder. I'm a leader. I think a lot of my instincts are kind of fatherly a lot of the time. But this gets me into conflict with people. Yeah. And I have to reconcile these different sides of me of like, how am I being too masculine in my relationships? Because I often am. And part of the way is like, I want there to be too much structure. If there's going to be like a social event, I want to know what we're doing. And I want to know why we're doing it. Yeah. And the feeling that there's no plan bothers me.
What's the goal?
Like, what's the goal here? And, that can sound kind of stupid. Like, it sounds like I'm crazy and neurotic or something like that. But, like, I don't really think that's true. It's just sort of like, I feel like time is valuable. I feel like my time is valuable, and often there are situations I feel like are a waste of time. And that's if I didn't have to work, or if I was independently wealthy, maybe I wouldn't care so much. Whatever.
Yeah.
There's a feeling of like, what are we doing here, and what's the point, and what's the rules here? Who's in charge here? That I kind of do instinctually.
Right.
And I have to realize that because part of that is what I'm doing is that makes people uncomfortable. Sometimes it hurts people's feelings.
Right.
Sometimes it makes people feel pushed, and a lot of people don't like being pushed.
Yeah.
So there has to be a recognition of like, well, how can I encourage my more feminine side?
Yeah.
Which is to be more sensitive to people's feelings,
More allowing.
more feeling, more going with the flow. There's kind of a notion of extroversion, I guess, that kind of plays into that a little bit, of sort of just like letting what happens happen.
Right. What works for the group.
Right. What works for the group. Don't be so concerned about getting anything done.
Right.
The group is here. Let's just be together. And that's kind of like a more feminine thing to do, is like, let's just be.
Right. Yeah. One thing I really kind of want to underline here is the tendency for individuals to over-identify with these kind of archetypal energies. And when that happens, it becomes restrictive, or it becomes limiting, or it lacks its flexibility. And so in this case, I don't think you're like fully over-identifying with masculine principle, but at times people really are, and they're caught up in that in a way that they're just not very conscious of, and that does cause tension. If you're over-identifying with a feminine principle, as an example, it's like you might be overly emotional. You might lack the objectivity that allows you to not get so swept up into a situation or your own emotional entanglement. One has to really be aware of those natural propensities towards how we want to orient and relate to the world. And if we might be over-identifying with it in a way that's actually causing more tension than not, and kind of turning towards the opposing principle and saying, how might I bring that in? How might that bring balance if I was to integrate more of that?
Or I would say you are someone who is really passive, someone who is not really trying to control as much, or trying to put any structure out there as much. It's important for you to perhaps to say, well, maybe I should be more structured, or maybe I should exhibit more control.
Yeah.
Maybe I do need more of a schedule for my life. Maybe I should be more goal-oriented. Maybe I should care a little more about what I need to get done, and less about what the group needs, perhaps.
Yeah, or like what's kind of being produced in this like measurable way.
Yeah.
So that you can actually like orient towards maybe like that future planning, or that external thing that takes you out of the passive nature and into one of the projective. Like you're creating, and you're expanding, and you're moving out into that more wild, unknown, scary world. And that requires that you leave behind the safety and nurturance of those castle walls that you're in right now. And it's going to kind of lead you more towards that path of individuation, of self-realization.
Right. This is also a play in romantic relationships very much often. Like the masculine feminine dynamic. I mean, usually it's a man and a woman who are exhibiting these patterns, and there's a lot of conflict that comes from that. There's a lot of like feeling like, why can't men and women get along, or why can't they understand each other, or why can't they communicate about things? And just bringing to awareness, how is it that women tend to think?
Right.
How is it that men tend to think?
Yeah.
What is it that my partner wants in this moment that I'm not seeing?
Yeah.
How is it possible that we want different things? And if your partner is more nurturing, is more empathetic, has more of a feeling of wanting to sort of bond, smooth things over with other people, and you're too fixated on like getting things done or solving a problem. If your partner comes to you and is complaining about work and saying that she got into this like conflict with someone at work, and your response is just like, well, why don't you just like go to the manager and like solve the problem, like make a formal complaint, or like just like, why don't you just handle it, babe? Like, why are you dealing with all this bullshit? Just handle it.
Yeah, she's gonna get hella mad.
And she gets hella mad because it's like, I feel like you're not listening to my feelings. I feel like you're just sort of invalidating what I'm saying. It's saying that I should like handle the problem.
Right.
I'm actually not looking for you to solve my problem right now.
Right.
I'm looking for you to be here with me, to be present with me, to share in my my frustration and pain.
Right. Sympathize with me, connect with me, understand what my experience is like, understand how this wounds me. Like, I know I need to fix it. I know I need to like do X, Y, and Z, but that's not the point. In those moments, often from that feminine principle, it's just about needing to express this is deeply like emotional vortex that's happening inside of oneself, and needing someone else to kind of anchor to with it. And so when you get like the response of that more masculine kind of like, well, here are all the ways you can fix it, why have you done this, it's just like not helpful.
Right. Another example, I mean, there's infinite examples of this, and the point is to kind of just try and think about these things. But you know, men, masculine individuals, they're very functional in the way they think about things. They're not very aesthetic. Like often their living spaces, male living spaces, for instance, are often very functional.
Right.
It's like they're only set up to accomplish certain tasks, and like who cares what it looks like? Who cares if it's messy? Who cares what the colors are?
Right.
And if this is you, you know, maybe you might get into more of the idea of aesthetics. What are aesthetics? What does it mean when things look nice or feel nice? Or what is it that you wear? Maybe you're someone, often male, who just never makes any attempt to dress nice at all.
No effort.
You just wear the same shoes you've been wearing for several years, and you always wear the same jeans every day, and you wear like a t-shirt and whatever, and maybe you have like your Swiss Army knife or your Leatherman knife on you all the time because it's really functional, and you don't care that it looks nerdy and stupid. That's the way you think. You know, you might try, you know, making your wardrobe more vibrant. You might try dressing a little more nice and louder colors, maybe, and
Yeah, like a little flamboyant.
Become a little more flamboyant.
Yeah.
And experiment with that.
Right.
Experiment with how that feels. I
Right.
mean, just personally, the idea of aesthetics is still not huge in my life, but it's something that I just didn't even think about at all in the past. In fact, I even thought it was kind of stupid. Like I would make fun of people who like fussed too much about how the way that things look.
Yeah.
But that's like a masculine misunderstanding of what aesthetics even are. It's like almost denying its existence.
Right.
And it's like you'll actually find that having a candle lit there's something nice about that.
Right, there's like an
feels
ambiance.
nice. There's an ambiance.
Yeah.
And you might find that like wearing a certain kind of shirt actually makes you feel more like yourself.
Yeah.
Instead of just like any old shirt will do.
Right.
And you kind of can be like, oh, I'm starting to get it. And that is sort of like a more feminine way of thinking.
Yeah, I think about clothes, and especially like the kind that I wear, as this really deeply personal, kind of emotional expression. Like I feel, at least personally, very tied and connected to a lot of pieces of clothes. I'm not someone who like loves clothes so much, but I enjoy donning something that makes me feel like myself, and that, if I was walking by and a friend kind of saw me, to be like, yeah, that was Alyssa. Like, she's wearing that jacket.
Right.
And it's a little, I'm thinking about my wolf jacket.
Right. Your huge white wolf jacket.
It's
Psychedelic wolf jacket.
amazing. But anyways, you don't have to wear a wolf jacket to do.
You don't have to.
You don't have to. You should,
Probably
because it's
should.
really cool. But it's this very like connected thing, and you're connecting to kind of like things and something you kind of wear upon yourself in this very ritualistic way, and it's connecting you to something a little bit more subtle, maybe something kind of that awakens a part of your psyche and your spirit in a way that you didn't realize.
And now it's time for a dream from one of our audience members. This is from a 34-year-old male. We would like more male dreams, so if you are a man, please send in your dream. And here's the dream. It started in Brooklyn, New York, at my grandmother's old apartment from when I was a kid. My older brother was there too. I look out the window and see a T-Rex destroying things. It's approaching, and we make eye contact. My brother and I jump out of a window and a white curtain from the fifth floor. The dinosaur stuck its head inside the other window and almost licked my ear. We land in the Bronx, New York, where my children live. I went around the front of the building to save the kids. A fire engine parked right outside. I got on a ladder and pulled the kids through the window. My daughter tried putting on sneakers and was dancing and playing. I come down from the ladder and notice a multitude of Greyhound coach buses outside. I go inside and the dinosaur starts chasing us, then rips the back of the bus apart. He is chasing us like in Jurassic Park, knocking over boulders on top of the bus. I was able to push the boulders off, and then we lose the dinosaur. I see my brother driving behind us in a taxi that is colored neon pink. We go back to my grandma's house to learn that my close uncle died. I cried and woke up.
So I like having this dream, especially for this episode, because we're getting this very classically masculine expression. It's like quite a hero's journey that this dream is.
Yeah, it's very much a man's dream.
Yeah.
That was my first instinct. It's like, this is a little different than the dreams we've done so far. It seems like he's battling a T-Rex and driving cars around and traveling very quickly and rescuing people.
Right. And if you've been listening to the podcast, we have had a lot of women write in, which we really appreciate. But when we have that sort of equal representation, we can see how the psyche of that is more masculine in nature expresses itself even in the unconscious. Because here we have fighting, the battling of this big figure. There's a lot of heroism and courage that's happening.
Fire trucks.
Yeah, fire trucks. So I want to start just with some of the symbolism around being at the grandma's house. And this is like an old apartment from when he was a kid. And at times when individuals dream of old environments, you can think about it or at least contemplate what reason your psyche might be returning to this place in time. What's going on that might be stirred within you, or something that you're confronting in your life that has its roots or its ties to this place. And so the dream opens and it begins in this apartment from when he was a kid. And there's lots of family-oriented aspects going on. The brother, the uncle, his children. So those themes might be very prevalent right now for the dreamer. And it's all very much characterized by this quite intense chase scene, very blockbuster-like, as he said. It's very Jurassic Park, but it's also very primitive in nature. The chase dream is something that brings one back to that instinctive nature of needing to run away from that which might kind of devour you.
Right. So there is the T-Rex is sort of this dragon figure that is present in a lot of dreams. Dragon of chaos, something that is devouring things, something that is coming for you.
Yeah.
Something that is too powerful for you to defeat. And so there's just this running away. And as you said, there's a lot of family in this dream.
Yeah.
There's a lot of time in this dream. It's going from an apartment when he was a kid to going to his kid's apartment.
Right.
So there's this traveling through time, almost like cyclically, almost and a lot of movement, a lot of different living spaces, being in a car, driving around, being chased in this way. So there's a lot of chaos in this dream, a lot of movement, maybe a feeling of a lack of control, maybe a feeling that things are moving too quickly, maybe something is happening with the family that is disrupting the sense of security.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of context to go off of with this dream, so I can only sort of throw out, ideas of what these symbols sort of speak on these broader strokes. But at times when we have these really powerful, dynamic chase dreams, we are dealing with unconscious material that has a very shadowy nature, and there's something really deep within you that is trying to emerge, that's trying to be known, and it's incredibly threatening. And when you have some unconscious material in the shadow that has that sense of threat, scariness, something that you don't want to see, it often materializes in the dreamscape as some sort of big figure that's chasing you, or a group of people, or there's something out to get you. And so I would encourage the dreamer to really think about what's going on, both in your obvious awareness, but also kind of deep within. Have things been stirring? Does something kind of, especially connected to the past, need to be addressed, kind of lifted into the light of consciousness and integrated?
Right. He mentions that his uncle died at the end of the dream. He learns that his uncle has died. And I guess it's not clear whether that's actually happened in real life.
Yeah, we don't know.
Or if the uncle's sick. but the grandmother also perhaps is no longer alive. So there is feelings of death or people disappearing,
Yeah.
or concern that someone familial is in trouble, going to the kid's house to protect the kids, and then succeeding in that, but arriving back at the grandmother's house just to learn that the uncle died.
Yeah, you know, I think I've mentioned this in other episodes, but there's this tension in dream interpretation between the subjective and the objective. Do you interpret all of these figures in your dreams as parts of yourself? Is it a commentary on things that are happening in the external world, which is more of the objective dynamic?
Right.
And there's something, call it just like an intuition, but there's something about just the way this dream has been communicated that speaks to me of like a lot of objective dynamics. And so I'm just really curious of what's going on in this dreamer's life between these intricate family ties and what is rooted in the past that might have to do with these this period of development. If there was anything that was kind of destabilizing that might now be kind of coming back around, because it's needing to be known. Of course, some of these figures might represent aspects of the dreamer. For example, like he might actually have kids, but it might also be the inner child. You might sometimes see that when someone needs to do that deep inner child work, that you'll see imaged in the dreams, children, and that's like your inner child that needs saving. And so that's something to consider as well.
Right. There's absolutely no evidence for this at all, but I do kind of wonder if there's any sort of pattern that you might see between masculine and feminine as far as having that sort of objective aspect of the dream versus subjective. It's like the people in your dream might be just you, versions of you. The unconscious is really speaking through you very, very powerfully that way, as opposed to kind of being more rationally oriented, and even in your dreams trying to problem solve and problem solving in this way where the sort of external real world is actually in your dream, and the unconscious is not speaking as loudly. It's being buried in the dream. Like, so again, I'm just throwing that out there. There's absolutely no evidence to say that's true, but I think it's kind of an interesting idea. The idea, if you are a masculine thinker, that your dreams might still be more oriented towards problem solving and thinking about things that need to be done in your life.
I mean, to be honest, like, you know, with my my approach and my orientation towards dream work, it's that, you know, in this deeply sort of unknowable and mysterious way, like that's like the function of the unconscious. It's kind of compensating for the conscious attitude, and in that way it's kind of problem solving, and it's kind of imaging all of these different things that need to be considered, maybe like a certain tool of your own personality as an example that needs to be utilized, a relational dynamic that needs to be considered from a different perspective. So there's just this inherently very kind of problem solving, I guess, is an interesting way to put it. But I do feel like just like the unconscious sort of dynamic is presenting that for us to work with. And that kind of in and of itself is a sort of masculine principle.
Do you have a question for us? Do you have a dream you'd like us to analyze? Is there a topic you'd like us to cover?
We want to hear from you. Contact us through the submission form, which can be found at our Instagram page at Golden Shadow Podcast. Or if you're listening on YouTube, you can find the link in the description down below.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Golden Shadow Podcast. Thank you.